The dust rose in soft clouds across the diamond, a geometry of hope sketched into Wisconsin earth, and in that summer of 1944, something impossible was happening at Camp McCoy. The war raged across oceans, swallowing young men into its throat of fire and steel, yet here, in this peculiar theater of captivity, American soldiers were teaching their enemies how to swing a bat, how to run bases, how to slide into home with the kind of abandon that war had stolen from all of them. Takeshi Yamamoto stood at the edge of the makeshift field, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the wooden bat. The weight felt foreign, not like the rifle he had carried through the jungles of Guadalcanal, not like the sword his grandfather had passed down through generations of samurai blood. This was something else entirely, a tool of play, of joy, concepts that seemed to belong to another lifetime, another world where young men did not kill each other under orders from distant capitals. He had expected interrogations when the American patrol found him, half-starved and delirious with fever, hiding in a cave that smelled of death and desperation. He had been prepared for brutality, for the kinds of tortures his commanding officers had warned would come if he were ever captured. They had told him the Americans were demons, that they would desecrate his body, dishonor his spirit, make him wish for death. Instead, they gave him water. Clean water. And later, after the doctors had treated his wounds and the fever had broken, they gave him a baseball glove. The leather was soft and worn, carrying the scent of another man's sweat and dreams. Sergeant Bill Morrison had placed it in Takeshi's hands with a smile that seemed to illuminate something in the perpetual dusk of captivity. Morrison was from Iowa, a farm boy with shoulders broad as barn doors and eyes the color of cornflowers. He spoke no Japanese, and Takeshi's English was limited to the phrases he had learned from propaganda leaflets, but between them existed a language older than words, written in gestures and shared laughter and the universal grammar of a ball arcing through summer air. The other prisoners watched with suspicion at first, their faces carved from stone, eyes reflecting the shame of survival when death had been promised as the only honorable path. They had been taught that capture meant eternal disgrace, that their families would be shunned, their names erased from family registers, their spirits condemned to wander without rest. Some had attempted seppuku when capture became inevitable, only to be stopped by American medics who did not understand why these men were so desperate to die. The Americans could not comprehend the weight of dishonor that settled on their shoulders like wet concrete, could not fathom the cultural architecture that made death preferable to this strange kindness. Takeshi remembered his first night at Camp McCoy, lying on a clean bunk with a real mattress, stomach full of food that tasted nothing like the sparse rations they had survived on during those final, desperate months. The barracks were heated. There were showers with hot water. Men played cards and wrote letters home, and the guards did not beat them or starve them or force them to labor until their bodies broke. It was disorienting, this gentleness, more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty he understood. Cruelty confirmed everything he had been taught about the enemy. But this humanity, shattered the narratives that had sustained him through the war's darkest hours. He had lain awake that first night, listening to the breathing of other prisoners, wondering if this was some elaborate psychological torture, if the Americans were fattening them up for some more sinister purpose. Trust was a luxury they could not afford, even as their bodies responded gratefully to warmth and nourishment and rest. The baseball lessons began in late spring, when the Wisconsin cold finally loosened its grip and the earth softened enough to run on without breaking ankles. Morrison had approached the camp commander with the idea, arguing that physical activity would improve morale, reduce tensions, give the men something constructive to focus on besides their shame and uncertainty. The commander, a pragmatic man from Philadelphia who had seen enough death to appreciate the value of life in any form, approved the plan. Bats and balls were procured from local high schools. Bases were marked with flour and chalk. The guards were instructed to participate, to play alongside the prisoners rather than simply supervise them. It was an experiment in radical humanism, born from the belief that even enemies could find common ground in the simple act of play. The first practice was chaos. Most of the prisoners had never seen baseball played, had no concept of the rules or strategy or even the basic mechanics of throwing and catching. They fumbled the ball, swung wildly at pitches, ran the bases in the wrong direction. The American soldiers laughed, not with mockery but with genuine amusement and patience, demonstrating again and again until muscle memory began to form. Morrison worked personally with Takashi, recognizing something in the young Japanese soldier, an intensity, a hunger to understand, to master this foreign ritual that seemed to bring such joy to their captors. They spent hours together, Morrison pitching slowly, encouraging Takashi to keep his eye on the ball, to step into the swing, to trust his body's instincts. Language barriers dissolved in the shared concentration, in the satisfying crack of bat meeting ball, in the primal thrill of running, of moving through space with purpose and speed. Slowly, something transformed in Takashi. The bat became familiar in his hands, an extension of his body rather than an alien object. He learned to anticipate the pitch, to read the subtle signals in Morrison's stance and release. His first solid hit, a line drive that shot between first and second base, produced a roar of approval from both prisoners and guards that made his chest constrict with an emotion he could not name. It was not pride exactly, because pride seemed forbidden to a defeated soldier, but something adjacent to it, something that tasted of humanity reclaimed. The other prisoners began to soften, to show interest despite their initial resistance. Baseball became a language of integration, a neutral territory where rank and nationality mattered less than whether you could turn a double play or lay down a perfect bunt. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was harder to reach. A career military man from a distinguished family, he had been captured after the Battle of Saipan, where he had fought with desperate courage as the island fell. He maintained rigid discipline among the prisoners, insisting on military protocols, resisting what he perceived as American attempts to weaken their spirits through comfort and entertainment. He viewed the baseball games with contempt, seeing them as collaboration, as betrayal of the warrior code that had defined his entire existence. His face was severe, marked by a scar that ran from temple to jaw, and his eyes held the kind of hardness that comes from witnessing too much death too young. He spoke to Takashi one evening, voice low and dangerous, warning him against becoming too friendly with the enemy, reminding him that the war was not over, that they were still soldiers of the emperor, that this imprisonment was temporary and their conduct would be remembered and judged. But even Tanaka could not entirely resist the magnetic pull of the games. He watched from a distance at first, arms crossed, expression disdainful, but Takashi noticed how his eyes tracked the ball, how his body tensed during close plays, how something flickered in his face when a prisoner made a particularly good catch or executed a difficult throw. One afternoon, when they were short a player and Morrison invited Tanaka to join, he hesitated for a long moment before stepping onto the field. His first at-bat was terrible, he swung awkwardly, off balance, missing by a foot. But his second was better. And his third connected, sending the ball bouncing toward the outfield, giving him time to reach first base safely. The smile that touched his face was small and quickly suppressed, but it was there, undeniable as sunrise, a crack in the armor he had built around his humanity. The games became ritualized, occurring several times a week, weather permitting. Teams formed organically, mixing Americans and Japanese, creating alliances that transcended the war's divisions. They traded lessons, the Americans teaching baseball fundamentals while the Japanese taught them phrases in their language, shared stories about their families, their homes, the lives they had lived before the war transformed them into enemies. Morrison learned that Takashi had been a teacher before conscription, that he loved poetry and calligraphy, that he had a younger sister he worried about constantly. Takashi learned that Morrison had left a young wife in Iowa, that he missed the smell of fresh-cut hay, that he had never wanted to be a soldier but had volunteered anyway when Pearl Harbor was attacked because it seemed like the right thing to do. These revelations were small, shared in broken English and pantomime and the universal language of shared humanity, but they accumulated like snow, gradually burying the hatred that propaganda had tried to cultivate. There were tensions, of course. Some guards remained hostile, unable or unwilling to see the Japanese prisoners as anything other than the enemy who had killed their brothers, destroyed their ships, pulled America into a war it never wanted. Some prisoners clung to their shame and anger, viewing the baseball games as a humiliation, a trivialization of their suffering and sacrifice. Arguments erupted occasionally, insults were exchanged, and once a fight broke out between a guard and a prisoner over a disputed call at home plate. But these incidents became rarer as summer deepened, as the rhythms of the game established their own order, their own logic that superseded military hierarchies and national allegiances. On the field, what mattered was whether you could hit, whether you could catch, whether you could work with your teammates to achieve something that existed purely for its own sake, untainted by the war's terrible pragmatism. Takeshi began to dream differently. Before, his sleep had been haunted by the jungle's green darkness, by the screams of wounded men, by the moment he had been forced to fix his bayonet and charge across open ground toward American machine gun positions, expecting each breath to be his last. He had killed men in that charge. He did not know how many. In the chaos and terror, individual faces had blurred together, but he remembered the weight of his rifle after the bayonet struck home, remembered the resistance of flesh and then the sudden give as he pushed through. Those memories had pursued him into captivity, had made sleep something to be feared and avoided. But now, increasingly, he dreamed of baseball. He dreamed of perfect swings, of the ball rising against blue sky, of running bases in a stadium that existed nowhere in reality but seemed more real than the war had ever been. He dreamed of Morrison's laughter, of the way the sun felt on his face during afternoon games, of a future where such moments might be possible without the shadow of captivity hanging over them. The summer of 1944 gave way to autumn, and the leaves around Camp McCoy turned colors that reminded Takeshi achingly of home, of the maple forests near his village where he had walked as a child. The baseball games continued even as the weather cooled, the prisoners and guards playing until their fingers grew numb, until the first snow made the field unplayable. By then, something fundamental had shifted. The prisoners no longer expected brutality. The guards no longer saw monsters. They saw men, complicated and flawed and human, bound together by the arbitrary geography of war but connected by something deeper and more enduring. They saw teammates. They saw, however imperfectly, themselves reflected in each other's faces. Morrison was transferred in November, reassigned to a base in California in preparation for the Pacific Campaign's next phase. The night before he left, he gave Takeshi his baseball glove, the one they had used during those first awkward practices, the one that had somehow become a talisman of transformation. Takeshi held it like a holy object, understanding that it represented more than leather and stitching. It represented the possibility of redemption, the chance that men who had been shaped into instruments of death might find their way back to something resembling grace. They stood together in the cold darkness, breath visible in the November air, and Morrison said, "After this is over, you should come to Iowa. We'll play real baseball, on a real field, without any of this other nonsense." His voice caught on the words, and Takeshi understood that Morrison was offering him something precious, a vision of a future where the war was merely history, where they could meet as equals, as friends, as men who had survived darkness and found light in the most unlikely places. Takeshi never made it to Iowa. Records show that he was repatriated to Japan in 1946, part of the mass return of prisoners after the war's end. What happened to him after that is lost to history's gaps and silences. Perhaps he returned to teaching. Perhaps he told his sister about the strange American summer when enemies taught each other to play baseball. Perhaps he kept the glove, hidden away like a secret, a reminder that humanity persists even in circumstances designed to extinguish it. Or perhaps the shame of survival was too great, the judgment of a defeated nation too harsh, and he disappeared into the anonymity of post-war chaos, carrying his memories like wounds that never quite healed. But the glove itself survived. Morrison brought it home to Iowa, where it sat in his garage for decades, accumulating dust and the smell of motor oil and slowly decaying rubber. His children found it after his death in 1989, along with a box of photographs that included several from Camp McCoy. One photograph showed Morrison and a young Japanese man standing together on a baseball diamond, both grinning, arms around each other's shoulders. On the back, in Morrison's careful handwriting, was written, "Takeshi Yamamoto, Camp McCoy, 1944. One hell of a player. One hell of a man." His daughter donated the glove and photographs to a museum dedicated to preserving the complicated history of World War II, where they became part of an exhibition exploring the treatment of prisoners of war. The glove sits in a climate-controlled case now, its leather cracked and brittle with age, but still somehow radiating the echoes of those summer afternoons when enemies learned to play together, when war's certainties dissolved in the simple joy of a well-hit ball. The story of Camp McCoy's baseball games is a small one in the vast catalog of World War II narratives. It does not appear in strategic analyses or discussions of major battles. It did not change the war's outcome or alter its trajectory. But it mattered enormously to the men who lived it, who found in those games a reminder of who they had been before the war and who they might become after. It demonstrated something that seems almost radical in its simplicity, that recognition of shared humanity does not require agreement or alliance or even understanding. It requires only the willingness to see the person beyond the uniform, to acknowledge the common ground of mortality and hope in the simple pleasure of play. Years later, after the war had ended and the camps had closed and the prisoners had returned to their shattered homeland, occasional letters arrived at Morrison's farm. They were written in careful English, translated by someone more fluent than the writer, and they spoke of gratitude and memory and the strange alchemy that had transformed captivity into something approaching grace. One letter, received in 1952, described how a group of former prisoners had organized a baseball team in their village, teaching the game to local children, passing on the gift that had been given to them in a prisoner of war camp in Wisconsin. They played on a rough field carved from rice paddies, using equipment cobbled together from scavenged materials, but they played with joy and dedication, and they taught their children that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity if they choose to look. The children who learned baseball in that Japanese village grew up in the shadow of defeat and occupation, navigating a world transformed by atomic fire and existential shame. But they also grew up understanding something their parents' generation had learned too late, that war's divisions are artificial constructs, that nationality and ideology are thin veneers over the fundamental fact of shared human vulnerability. They carried that knowledge into adulthood, into careers and marriages and their own children's upbringing, creating ripples that extended far beyond that rough field in rural Japan. Some of them eventually visited the United States, following paths that would have been unimaginable to their fathers, and a few even made it to Iowa, to Morrison's farm, where they stood on American soil and remembered stories their fathers had told about a sergeant who taught them to swing a bat, who saw them as men rather than monsters, who offered them a glimpse of grace when they expected only judgment. Morrison himself rarely spoke about Camp McCoy. Like many veterans, he found that the war's intimate experiences resisted translation into civilian language, that the extraordinary moments of connection and transformation seemed diminished when reduced to anecdotes at dinner parties or reunions. How could he explain the profound strangeness of playing baseball with men he might have killed under different circumstances? How could he convey the way those games had restored something essential in him, had reminded him why the war was being fought in the first place, not for territory or ideology, but for the possibility of a world where young men could play baseball instead of killing each other? The memories sat in him like stones in a river, shaping the current of his life without ever being fully visible to those who knew him only as the farmer from Iowa, the quiet man who loved his wife and raised his children and attended church every Sunday. But late in his life, when his granddaughter asked him about the war, Morrison finally spoke. He told her about Takashi, about the baseball games, about the way enemies had become teammates, and then something more complicated than either term could capture. He told her about the fear in the prisoners' eyes when they first arrived, expecting torture and brutality, and the gradual dissolution of that fear as they realized the Americans intended them no harm. He told her about the moment Takashi hit his first home run, a soaring shot that cleared the makeshift fence and landed in the Wisconsin woods, and how every man on that field, American and Japanese alike, had cheered until their throats were raw. He told her that those games had taught him something crucial about human nature, that cruelty is learned but kindness is fundamental, that the capacity for compassion survives even war's determined efforts to extinguish it, that recognition of our common humanity is not a luxury but a necessity if we hope to survive our own worst impulses. His granddaughter recorded that conversation, preserving her grandfather's voice and words for future generations who would inherit a world shaped by the decisions and actions of men like Morrison and Takashi. The recording eventually found its way into the same museum that houses Morrison's baseball glove, becoming part of the archive of small stories that collectively reveal history's true texture. Researchers and students listened to Morrison's voice, cracking with age but still carrying the conviction of lived experience, and they hear something that textbooks cannot convey: the emotional reality of transformation, the personal cost of empathy, the quiet courage required to recognize humanity in the face of the enemy. The baseball diamond at Camp McCoy no longer exists. The camp itself was decommissioned after the war, its buildings demolished or repurposed, its grounds returned to the Wisconsin earth from which they had been temporarily claimed. But the geometry of that field persists in memory and testimony, in the photographs and letters and artifacts that survived when the physical structures did not. It exists in the descendants of prisoners and guards who carry forward the stories they inherited, who understand that their own existence is somehow bound up with those summer afternoons when enemies played baseball together. The field exists in the choice to believe that redemption is possible, that transformation can occur even in the darkest circumstances, that the capacity for grace survives war's determined efforts to destroy it. Takeshi Yamamoto's final fate remains uncertain, lost in the chaos of post-war Japan and the silences that survivors often maintained about their experiences. Perhaps he thrived, finding ways to integrate the contradictions of his wartime experience into a coherent life. Perhaps he struggled, unable to reconcile the kindness he received in captivity with the propaganda that had shaped his understanding of the enemy. Perhaps he fell somewhere between those extremes, living an ordinary life marked by extraordinary memories that he carried quietly, sharing them only rarely with those he trusted most. What is certain is that he existed, that he mattered, that his encounter with Morrison and baseball and unexpected grace left marks on the world that persist even in absence of complete documentation. The story of Camp McCoy's baseball games asks difficult questions about the nature of war and humanity. If enemies can recognize each other's fundamental sameness, if compassion can survive even under circumstances designed to extinguish it, then what does that say about the structures that make war possible? What does it reveal about the narratives we construct to justify violence against other human beings? The American soldiers who taught Japanese prisoners to play baseball were not naive pacifists. They had fought and killed. They had lost friends to Japanese bullets and bombs. They understood the war's stakes and supported its prosecution. But they also understood something more fundamental, that the men they held captive were not abstractions, not the demons portrayed in propaganda posters, but individuals as complicated and contradictory as themselves, equally deserving of basic human dignity. This recognition did not end the war. It did not prevent future conflicts. It did not resolve the complicated questions of justice and accountability that wars inevitably raise. But it created small spaces of humanity within war's dehumanizing machinery, demonstrated that even in the midst of industrialized killing, individuals can choose compassion over cruelty, connection over alienation, grace over vengeance. Those choices mattered to the men who made and received them. They mattered to the families who got their sons and fathers and brothers back alive. They mattered to subsequent generations who inherited a world slightly less broken because some men at a prisoner of war camp in Wisconsin decided to teach their enemies how to play baseball. The glove in its museum case has become a symbol, freighted with meanings that Morrison and Takeshi might not have anticipated. School groups file past it, teachers explaining the historical context, students trying to imagine the circumstances that gave this ordinary object such extraordinary significance. Some visitors are moved to tears by the story it represents. Others remain skeptical, suspicious that such accounts of cross-cultural connection are exaggerated or fabricated, unable to fit them into their understanding of war's binary logic. Both reactions are valid. The story is almost too perfect, too neatly illustrative of the values we want to believe in: compassion, redemption, shared humanity. But perfection does not negate truth. Sometimes reality delivers moments of grace that fiction would reject as implausible. Sometimes enemies do recognize each other as human. Sometimes a baseball glove becomes a bridge between irreconcilable worlds. As the years accumulate and the last survivors of World War II pass beyond reach, stories like this become increasingly precious. They complicate the simplified narratives that time and distance encourage, reminding us that war is experienced not as grand strategy but as millions of individual moments, each carrying its own moral weight and human significance. The veterans who fought that war were not saints or villains but ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, making choices constrained by forces beyond their control while still retaining the capacity for compassion and cruelty, for courage and fear, for all the contradictions that define human experience. They deserve to be remembered in their full complexity, not reduced to heroes or monsters but honored as men who survived darkness and sometimes, against all odds, found light. The baseball games at Camp McCoy represented one such moment of light, imperfect, complicated, existing within structures of power and captivity that nothing could erase, but genuine nonetheless. They demonstrated that even in war's midst, even when nations have committed themselves to mutual destruction, individual people can choose differently, can recognize their shared humanity and act accordingly. That choice does not make war acceptable or necessary. It does not redeem violence or justify suffering. But it offers something that might be even more important, evidence that the capacity for compassion survives even war's determined efforts to destroy it, that human connection can bridge even the most profound divisions, that grace is possible even in circumstances specifically designed to prevent it. Takeshi Yamamoto learned to play baseball in a prisoner of war camp in Wisconsin, taught by an enemy who saw him as a man rather than a monster. That simple fact contains multitudes. It speaks to the resilience of human dignity, to the transformative power of small acts of kindness, to the possibility that recognition can occur even across barriers of language and culture and historical enmity. It suggests that the future need not be constrained by the past's hatreds, that new beginnings are always possible if we possess the courage to imagine them. The baseball diamond at Camp McCoy existed for only a few seasons, but its significance extends far beyond those temporal and geographical boundaries. It exists wherever people choose connection over alienation, wherever compassion overcomes fear, wherever enemies recognize their fundamental sameness and choose accordingly. It exists in the choice to believe that grace is possible, that transformation can occur, that even war's darkness cannot entirely extinguish the light of human kindness. And it exists in a cracked leather glove sitting in a museum case, still carrying the ghost of summer afternoons when young men who should have been enemies learned instead to be teammates, and in that learning discovered something precious that war had tried but failed to destroy, the enduring recognition of shared humanity, more powerful than weapons, more lasting than empires, more true than any of the lies that make war possible.